The cold steel of the gun barrel was a shock against her temple. Not the pressure, but the cold. It was a deep, biting cold that seemed to suck the very warmth from her bones. A cold that belonged to the high, lonely places of the Wyoming mountains. Eleanor Hayes held her breath, the frigid air catching in her throat like a shard of glass. Behind her, a man's breathing came in hot, excited puffs against the nape of her neck, a disgusting counterpoint to the chill of the gun. He smelled of sweat and stale whiskey. "I know who you are," he whispered, his voice a ragged thing, thick with a malice that was all too familiar. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, but it was no use. The darkness behind her eyelids was already full of ghosts. She saw her sister Clara, her face a perfect porcelain mask of terror, her mouth open in a scream that Eleanor would hear for the rest of her days. 3 months. 3 months she had been running, hiding, burying Eleanor Hayes under layers of dirt and lies and rough-spun cotton. 3 months of becoming someone else, a boy named Eli with haunted eyes and hands too soft for a ranch hand. And it all ended here, in the stinking, piss-scented darkness of a livery stable, with a gun to her head. This was the end of the line. "Do it then," she managed to say, her voice a low, steady thing that didn't belong to her. It was Eli's voice, hard, unbroken. The hammer of the pistol clicked back, an obscene sound in the stillness. It was the sound of a period at the end of a sentence, the last sound she would ever hear. Eleanor Hayes braced herself for the explosion, for the sudden, violent darkness that would finally reunite her with Clara. The gunshot ripped through the night. But to understand how she got here, with the smell of gunpowder in her nostrils and the world tilting on its axis, you have to go back. Back 3 months to the spring of 1878, when the Wyoming Territory was a sprawling, untamed canvas, and a person could paint a whole new life for themselves if they had the nerve. Out here, a person could disappear. That was exactly what Eleanor Hayes was counting on. The Blackwood Ranch was a speck on the horizon that slowly grew into a sprawling testament to one man's iron will. It was a fortress of timber and stone carved out of the wilderness, a place of order in a world of chaos. As she rode closer, Eleanor straightened in the saddle, pulling her shoulders back, tucking her chin. She'd spent weeks practicing this, the walk, the talk, the posture of a young man, not a woman on the run. She was Eli now, just Eli, a boy looking for honest work, a drifter with no past to speak of. The thick cloth binding her chest was a constant, aching reminder of the lie. It dug into her ribs, making each breath a conscious effort. Her wide-brimmed hat, pulled low, cast her fine features into shadow, hiding the delicate curve of her jaw, the telltale arch of her brows. A folded bandana was tied loosely around her neck, a common enough accessory for a cowhand, but hers served a darker purpose. It concealed the thin, silvery scar that sliced across her throat, a parting gift from Randall Clayton, a man who didn't take no for an answer. A knot of men wrestled with a rearing Mustang near the main corral, their shouts lost in the vast Wyoming wind. Eleanor approached with caution, her hand resting near the butt of the pistol tucked into her oversized coat. Not that she ever wanted to use it. The gun was insurance, a last resort, a promise to herself that she would never be a victim again. One man broke away from the struggling group and walked toward her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather and left out in the sun. He moved with the slightest limp, favoring his right leg, but there was an authority in his posture that radiated from him like heat from a blacksmith's forge. Even from a distance, Eleanor knew. This was Thaddeus Blackwood. "Something I can help you with, boy?" His voice was gravel and whiskey, rough-edged but not entirely unkind. Eleanor pitched her own voice a full octave lower, the way she'd practiced for countless hours until her throat was raw. "Looking for work, sir. Heard you might be hiring." Blackwood's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over her. It was a clinical, assessing gaze, the look of a man who measured everything and everyone he met. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, Eleanor was certain he could see right through her, see the bound chest, the hidden fear, the woman cowering inside the boy's clothes. But then he simply spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and jerked his chin toward the chaos in the corral. "What can you do?" "Horses, mostly," she replied, sticking to the truth as much as possible. "Good with 'em, can ride anything, handle cattle, mend a fence." All true. Her father, a horse breeder back in Kentucky, had insisted his daughters learn to be self-sufficient, a trait society generally frowned upon in a woman. Right now, that unladylike education was the only thing keeping her alive. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to the wild-eyed Palomino stallion that was currently trying to stomp one of his best hands into the dirt. "That Mustang there, the one with murder on his mind. Think you can gentle him?" It was a test, a challenge thrown down like a gauntlet. Eleanor looked at the horse. He was magnificent, a whirlwind of golden muscle and terrified fury, thrashing against the ropes that held him. The ranch hands gave him a wide berth, one of them nursing what looked like a freshly broken arm. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Doubt was a weakness that would get her killed. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I can." A ghost of a smile, a fleeting thing that barely touched the corners of his mouth, appeared on Blackwood's lips. "Then show me." The world seemed to fall silent as Eleanor swung down from her saddle. She handed the reins to a slack-jawed ranch hand and walked toward the corral. She shrugged out of her oversized coat, draping it carefully over the fence rail, making sure the movement revealed nothing of her true shape. The Palomino snorted, a plume of hot air misting in the cool afternoon, his hooves pawing at the churned-up earth. He was a mirror of her own trapped soul, wild, terrified, ready to fight to the death. She climbed between the rails, her movements slow and deliberate. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing hum. "Easy, beautiful. No one's going to hurt you." The horse's ears, which had been pinned back in aggression, flickered forward, twitching at the sound of her voice. She didn't walk directly at him. She knew better. That was a predator's move. Instead, she walked the perimeter of the corral, a slow, circling path that telegraphed non-aggression. She began to hum, a soft, tuneless lullaby her mother used to sing, the vibration in her own chest a calming anchor in a sea of fear. Confidence. That was the key. Horses, like dangerous men, could smell fear. Show them fear, and they'd run you down. Show them arrogance, and they'd fight you until one of you was broken. But if you showed them respect, a quiet authority that asked for trust instead of demanding it, even the wildest spirit might just listen. The ranch hands had gone quiet. Even Thaddeus Blackwood watched from the fence, his face an unreadable mask. She reached the center of the corral and stopped. Slowly she extended her hand, palm down, an offering of peace. She waited. The Palomino tossed his magnificent head, his nostrils flaring as he drank in her scent. For several long, agonizing heartbeats, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then, almost too slowly to see, the tension in the stallion's powerful muscles began to ease. He took one hesitant, shuffling step forward, then another. "That's it," she whispered, her voice barely a breath of air. "You're all right. You're safe." He stretched his long neck, his soft, velvety muzzle reaching for her outstretched hand. Eleanor remained perfectly still, a statue of patience, even as her arm began to ache. Finally, the horse's muzzle brushed against her fingertips, a touch as soft as a sigh. A collective murmur rippled through the men watching from the fence. Moving with an agonizing slowness, she brought her other hand up, stroking the powerful column of his neck. The horse trembled under her touch, a tremor of fear and uncertainty. But he didn't pull away. He stood his ground. He was giving her a chance. She ran her fingers along his shoulder, down his foreleg, speaking to him the whole time in that same quiet, steady tone, a stream of nonsense and comfort. When she finally turned to face Thaddeus Blackwood, the Palomino's reins were looped loosely in her hand. The stallion stood beside her, calm and quiet, his earlier fury completely gone. The rancher's expression had shifted from cold skepticism to something else, something Eleanor couldn't quite name. "You start tomorrow," he said, his voice a gruff rumble. $2 a week, plus room and board. Victor will show you where to put your things." He gestured toward an older man with iron gray hair and a scowl that looked like it had been permanently etched into his face. "And boy?" "Yes, sir." "The name's Thaddeus Blackwood. Not sir. This isn't the army." With that, he turned and limped away. The matter apparently settled. But as Eleanor led the now docile stallion from the corral, she caught the look in the old foreman's eyes. The man named Victor was watching her, and his gaze was sharp, shrewd, and deeply suspicious. She had passed Blackwood's test, but she had a terrible feeling she had just walked straight into another one. And this one might be far more dangerous. Victor Maxwell was a man carved from silence and suspicion. He led Eleanor, Eli, to the bunkhouse, a long, low building that smelled of unwashed men, cheap tobacco, and worn leather. The air was thick with a kind of weary masculinity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. "You'll take that bunk there," Victor grunted, pointing to a narrow cot in the far corner. "Keep your things tidy. No drinking in the bunkhouse, no fighting, and no women." His eyes, small and sharp as a hawk's, lingered on Eli's face for a beat too long, as if he were trying to peel back the layers of her disguise with his gaze alone. "Breakfast at dawn. Don't be late." Eleanor just nodded, grateful for the relative privacy the corner afforded. "Thank you, Mr. Maxwell." "Victor," he corrected, his voice flat. "Mr. Maxwell was my father." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. "That thing you did with the horse, where'd you learn it?" Eleanor tensed, every muscle in her body going rigid. This was the first test. "My father," she said, clinging to a piece of the truth. It was a good anchor in a sea of lies. "He had a way with them." Had. He's dead. That was also true. Dead along with her mother and Clara, leaving her all alone to face the obsessive, predatory attention of Randall Clayton. Leaving her to face his rage when she refused him. Victor studied her for another long, uncomfortable moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a curt nod. "Most folks who end up out here are running from something, boy. Just make sure whatever it is doesn't follow you to Blackwood's door. He's had enough trouble to last 2 lifetimes." The cryptic warning hung in the air long after he was gone. Eleanor sank onto the lumpy mattress of her cot, her meager possessions, a single saddlebag containing a change of clothes, a small amount of cash, and the pistol, at her feet. The foreman's words echoed in her mind. He's had enough trouble to last 2 lifetimes. What did that mean? What kind of trouble had found its way to this remote, isolated ranch? One slip. One moment of carelessness. That's all it would take for her whole world to come crashing down. And if Randall Clayton ever found her? She shoved the thought away, pushing it down into the dark place where she kept her grief and her fear. For now she had a roof over her head, the promise of honest work, and a few precious hours where no one was pressing a gun to her head. In this new, terrifying world, that would have to be enough. But as the shadows lengthened in the bunkhouse and the snores of the other ranch hands began to fill the small space, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't escaped her past at all. She had just traded one cage for another, and she had no idea who held the key. That night in the main house, Thaddeus Blackwood sat in the deep twilight of his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the massive oak desk before him, the numbers in the ledger blurred, his thoughts drifting back to the strange boy who had ridden in that afternoon. Eli. No last name offered. Hands that were too smooth, too uncalloused for a seasoned ranch hand. A voice that was too careful, each word measured and weighed before being spoken. And those eyes. They were the eyes of an old soul in a young man's body, haunted and weary, yet lit by a fierce intelligence that seemed completely out of place. Something wasn't right. His gut, an instinct honed by years of war and loss, was screaming at him. A soft knock on the study door pulled him from his thoughts. "Enter," he called out, his voice a low rumble. Doc Sullivan stepped into the room, a welcome and familiar presence. At 68, the former Army surgeon was still as spry as a man half his age, his mind as sharp as his scalpel's had once been. Only the snow-white hair and the deep lines etched around his kind eyes gave away his years. "Evening, Thaddeus," Sullivan said, helping himself to the chair opposite the desk. "Heard from the boys you took on a new hand today. A regular miracle worker with horses, they say." Thaddeus pushed the untouched whiskey glass toward his old friend. Something about him doesn't sit right. Sullivan accepted the glass with a nod. Your famous instincts churning, or just your usual suspicion of anything that wasn't born on this ranch? A faint smile touched Thaddeus's lips. After 13 years, Doc Sullivan was the only man alive who could speak to him so plainly. Maybe both. There's more to that boy than meets the eye. Isn't there more to all of us? Sullivan took a thoughtful sip of whiskey. His expression turned serious. Any news from Sheriff Daniels? The change in topic was expected, but it landed like a punch to the gut every single time. Thaddeus's jaw clenched. Nothing useful. He still claims there's no evidence of foul play. Says Martha likely just left. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. 5 years. 5 years since his wife, Martha, had vanished without a trace on a trip into town. 5 years of searching, of hoping, of slowly, agonizingly being crushed by the terrible weight of her absence. The whispers in town had never stopped. Martha Blackwood grew tired of the frontier. She ran off with a younger man. She just walked out into the wilderness, unable to bear the isolation. Lies. All of it. Martha would never have left. Not without a word. Not without a sign. She had loved this ranch. She had loved him. Despite the wounds he carried, the ones on the surface and the ones hidden deep inside, she had loved him. Thaddeus. Sullivan's voice brought him back to the present. I heard something in town yesterday about Randall Clayton. At the mention of that name, Thaddeus's hand instinctively went to his bad leg, the old war wound throbbing in time with his heartbeat. What about him? He's expanding his railroad operations, buying up land all across the territory, using any means necessary. Word is, he's got his eye on properties around here. Let him look, Thaddeus said, his voice flat and hard as granite. This land isn't for sale. Not to him, not to anyone. I know that, Sullivan said, his expression grave. But Clayton isn't a man who is accustomed to hearing the word no. And with his connections in the territorial government, are you suggesting I should be worried, Robert? I'm suggesting you should be careful, Sullivan replied, draining his glass. Clayton has a way of getting what he wants, one way or another. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Both men knew Randall Clayton's reputation, a self-made tycoon who had clawed his way to the top on a ladder made of other people's misfortune. A man who was charming in public and utterly ruthless in private. A man who didn't see obstacles. He saw things to be eliminated. I've dealt with worse men than Randall Clayton, Thaddeus said, the words feeling hollow even to his own ears. Sullivan's eyes were filled with a deep, weary sadness. Have you, my friend? Have you really? Before Thaddeus could answer, a sudden commotion erupted from the yard outside. Shouts, the sound of splintering wood, and the terrified whinny of a horse. Thaddeus was on his feet in an instant, his limp all but forgotten, with Sullivan right behind him. They moved to the window and peered out into the lantern-lit darkness. It was the Palomino stallion. He had broken loose from the corral again and was charging wildly across the yard, straight for the bunkhouse, where several men were scrambling for safety. But as they watched, a slight figure darted out from the shadows, placing himself directly in the horse's path. It was the boy, Eli. He stood his ground, a small, defiant figure against the thundering chaos bearing down on him. He didn't flinch. He didn't move to dodge the deadly hooves. At the last possible second, as the stallion was nearly upon him, the boy stepped sideways with an almost fluid grace, catching the trailing rein as the horse swept past. The momentum nearly ripped him from his feet, but somehow he held on, using the horse's own power to turn its wild charge into a tight, controlled circle. Remarkable, Sullivan murmured beside him. It was more than remarkable. It was unbelievable. The boy spoke to the horse, his words lost to the wind, but his calm, authoritative presence was a tangible thing, even from a distance. Slowly, gradually, the Palomino's wild-eyed panic began to subside. Its heaving sides began to still. The wildness seemed to drain out of it, replaced by a quivering, exhausted trust. Thaddeus found himself studying the young man with a renewed, sharpened interest. There was a grace to his movements, an elegance that was completely at odds with his rough clothing and his supposed station. He was a walking contradiction, a living, breathing mystery. And if there was one thing Thaddeus Blackwood couldn't stand, it was a mystery he couldn't solve. He would get to the bottom of who this boy, Eli, really was. He just hoped that when he found the truth, it wouldn't be another tragedy come to call at his door. Eleanor's first week at the Blackwood Ranch was a tightrope walk over a canyon of pure exhaustion. The work was bone-achingly familiar, a brutal rhythm of mucking stalls at dawn and mending fences till dusk. But the real labor, the truly draining work, was maintaining the lie. Every morning she bound her chest so tightly that each breath was a sharp, painful reminder of her deception. She consciously pitched her voice low, adopted a swaggering, bow-legged walk that made her hips ache, and found excuses to avoid the communal bathing time at the creek, arousing more than a few suspicious glances from the other hands. The hardest part was remembering to answer to the name Eli. It felt foreign, an ill-fitting coat she couldn't get used to. By the end of the seventh day, her muscles screamed in protest, and her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Yet underneath it all, there was a strange, fragile sense of peace. Out here in the vast, empty heart of Wyoming, she could almost believe she had outrun Randall Clayton's long shadow. Almost. The evening brought a welcome silence. The other hands had taken their weekly pay and ridden into the nearby town of Redemption, a place whose name seemed like a cruel joke, leaving Eleanor blissfully alone in the bunkhouse. With trembling hands, she unwound the cloth binding, gasping as her lungs filled with air for the first time since dawn. She allowed herself the small luxury of brushing out her shorn hair. She had cried when she cut the long chestnut locks that had been her one vanity, another piece of Eleanor Hayes sacrificed for the sake of survival. A floorboard creaked outside the bunkhouse door. Eleanor froze, brush in midair, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. Footsteps, unhurried, deliberate. They were coming closer. With frantic, clumsy haste, she rewound the binding, her breath catching in her throat, and yanked her rough cotton shirt back over her head. She jammed her hat on just as the door swung open. Thaddeus Blackwood stood silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. "Sir, I mean, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor stammered, cursing the breathless, high-pitched quality of her own voice. "I didn't expect—" "Relax, boy," he said, though something in his tone suggested he'd noticed her flustered state. "I need you to exercise that Palomino. He's taken a liking to you, and he needs the work." Relief washed through her, so intense it almost made her dizzy. "Of course. Right now?" "No, next Christmas," Blackwood replied, his voice laced with dry irony. "Yes, now. He's saddled and waiting by the main house." She followed him out into the cool evening air, forcing herself to remember the bow-legged walk, the downcast eyes of a simple ranch hand. The Palomino stood waiting, his golden coat shimmering in the last light of day. He nickered softly as she approached, nuzzling her hand. "Hey there, beautiful," she murmured, stroking his neck. Blackwood watched her, his expression a familiar mix of curiosity and suspicion. "There's a trail that follows the creek up into the foothills. About a 5-mile loop. Don't push him too hard, and be back before it's full dark." Eleanor swung into the saddle, the familiar feel of worn leather a small comfort. "Yes, sir, Mr. Blackwood." His mouth twitched, the ghost of that rare smile returning. "You got that sir drilled into you pretty deep for a drifter." Panic flared in her chest. She hadn't thought about how her careful, respectful speech might seem out of place. "No, sir, just how I was raised." He didn't seem convinced. "Watch yourself up near the ridge. Been signs of a mountain lion." With that, he turned and limped back toward the house, leaving Eleanor to guide the Palomino onto the creek trail. The cool air felt good on her face, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax, just a little, savoring the simple pleasure of a good horse under her and open country ahead. The Palomino moved eagerly, his powerful muscles working smoothly beneath her. They had almost reached the foothills when she saw it. A small, weathered cabin tucked away in a grove of aspen trees, almost invisible against the landscape. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. Someone was living there. Curiosity, a dangerous luxury she knew she couldn't afford, got the better of her. She reined in the Palomino, her eyes fixed on the strange, isolated structure. It was too far from the main ranch to be convenient, yet it was clearly maintained. A line cabin for winter, perhaps? As she watched, the cabin door opened, spilling a rectangle of warm, golden lamplight onto the porch. Doc Sullivan emerged, his familiar medical bag in hand. He was followed by Thaddeus Blackwood himself. The two men spoke quietly for a moment, their postures serious, before the doctor mounted his own horse and rode off toward town. Blackwood remained on the porch, a solitary, lonely figure outlined against the light. There was a bone-deep weariness in the way he stood that tugged at something inside Eleanor. Then, as if he could feel her watching him, he looked up. His eyes, sharp and piercing, even across the distance, met hers. Panic seized her. Had he recognized her? Would he demand to know why she was spying on him? She jerked the Palomino's reins, wheeling the horse around and urging him into a frantic canter, her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't slow down until she was miles away, her own breath coming in ragged gasps that matched the heaving sides of the horse. It was foolish. So foolish. Curiosity was a weakness, a flaw that could get her killed. By the time she returned to the ranch, full darkness had fallen. She was rubbing down the Palomino, whispering apologies for her rough handling, when a figure emerged from the deep shadows of the barn. It was Victor. "Enjoy your ride?" he asked. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp and knowing in the dim lantern light. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice carefully neutral. "It's beautiful country." "It is that." Victor struck a match against the barn wall, the sudden flare illuminating his weathered face as he lit a hand-rolled cigarette. The tip glowed red in the darkness. "Find anything interesting up there?" He knew, or at least he suspected. Eleanor's mouth went dry. "Just followed the trail, like Mr. Blackwood said." Victor took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember brightening. "Funny thing about this place," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Seems like everyone's got secrets, even the land itself." He fixed her with a long, penetrating stare. "Sleep well, Eli. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He melted back into the darkness, leaving Eleanor with the chilling certainty that he had just delivered a warning. But a warning about what? Or who? The secrets of the land? Or the secrets of the man who owned it? That night, Eleanor dreamed of Clara. Not the screaming, terrified Clara of her nightmares, but the laughing, vibrant Clara from before. "You were always the careful one, Ellie," her dream sister said, her voice full of light. "Always watching, always planning. But you can't plan for everything. Sometimes the heart leads where the mind fears to follow." She woke with tears on her cheeks and a hollow ache in her chest. For the first time since she'd started running, she allowed herself to wonder if just surviving was enough. Was this life, a lie lived every single waking moment, truly living at all? The thought haunted her, a persistent shadow that even the bright Wyoming sun couldn't chase away. She was mucking out a stall, lost in her troubled thoughts, when she rounded the corner of the barn and walked straight into Thaddeus Blackwood. "Careful there, boy," he said, his hands shooting out to steady her by the shoulders. The brief contact, the strength in his grip, sent a jolt of pure alarm through her. She flinched away, pulling her hat down lower. "Sorry, Mr. Blackwood. Wasn't watching where I was going." He studied her face, his brow furrowed in what looked like genuine concern. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The observation was so close to the truth, it almost made her laugh. She forced a smile instead. "Just didn't sleep well, sir." "There you go with that sir again." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Come with me. I've got a job for you that might be more interesting than mucking stalls." Curious in spite of herself, she followed him to a separate corral where a dozen or so wild mustangs milled about nervously. They were rough, hardy-looking animals, fresh from the spring roundup. But one stood out from the rest. A tall, fine-boned black mare with a single white star blazing on her forehead. She had the unmistakable lines of a thoroughbred. Where did she come from? Eleanor asked, drawn to the mare's proud, fearful bearing. Found her running with the wild herd, Blackwood replied, his eyes also on the mare. But she's no Mustang. Someone's prize horse, I'd wager. Stolen or escaped. The mare paced the fence line, her movements a mixture of nervous energy and defiant grace. There was something in her eyes, a combination of terror and pride, that resonated with Eleanor on a deep, unspoken level. She understood this creature. She was this creature. I'll start with her, she heard herself say. Blackwood raised a skeptical eyebrow. She's the most difficult of the bunch. Might want to work your way up to that one. No. Eleanor shook her head, her gaze locked on the mare. She's the one. For a long moment, Blackwood just looked at her, his expression impossible to read. Then he gave a slow nod. Your funeral, boy, but I won't have a horse ruined by impatience. You take your time with her. Understand? However long it takes. There was a strange gentleness in his voice, a layer of something soft hidden beneath the gruff exterior that caught her completely by surprise. She found herself wondering about the man Thaddeus Blackwood had been before sorrow had carved those deep lines into his face. I understand, she said softly. And she did. Some wounds couldn't be rushed. Some trust, once it was broken, could only be rebuilt with infinite patience and time. It was a lesson she had learned at a terrible, terrible cost. As she climbed into the corral with the beautiful, terrified mare, she had the unnerving feeling that she wasn't just talking about the horse anymore. The black mare, whom Eleanor had secretly named Duchess, became her sanctuary. In the round pen, with the scent of horse and dust in the air, she could almost forget the constant, gnawing fear. The mare was a mirror, reflecting Eleanor's own terror, her own pride, her own deep-seated distrust of the world. Gentling Duchess became a way of gentling herself. Each small victory, the first time the mare allowed a touch, the first time she took a carrot from Eleanor's hand, the first time she lowered her head in acceptance, felt like a piece of her own broken spirit was being mended. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, she sought out a secluded pool farther up the creek, desperate for a moment of privacy, a chance to wash away the grit and the grime, and for a few precious minutes to simply be Eleanor. The path wound through a stand of whispering aspen trees, their leaves shimmering like silver coins in the fading light. As she crested a small rise, she saw it, a simple wooden cross, weathered and gray, standing sentinel over a carefully tended patch of wildflowers. It was a grave, unmarked, anonymous, but clearly not forgotten. Someone cared for this place. A twig snapped behind her. Eleanor whirled around, her hand flying to the hilt of the knife she always wore at her belt. Thaddeus Blackwood stood a few paces away, a small bouquet of fresh wildflowers in his hand. His expression was a startling mix of surprise and a dark, complex pain. He had caught her trespassing on what was clearly sacred ground. Mr. Blackwood, she stammered, her heart pounding. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I was just... It's all right, he said, his voice rougher than usual. You were bound to find it eventually. Curious sort that you are. The words were a clear reference to her unsanctioned ride a few nights before. I can go, she offered, already backing away. No. The words seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. He moved past her and knelt beside the cross, replacing the older, wilted flowers with the fresh ones he'd brought. It's my wife, he said, his back to her. Or rather, it's where I come to remember her. Her body. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet grove. Her body was never found. The simple, brutal statement hung in the air, so heavy with grief that Eleanor felt her own throat tighten in sympathy. I'm sorry, she whispered, and she truly was. 5 years ago, he said, his voice low and ragged, his fingers tracing the rough wood of the cross. Martha went into town for supplies. She never came home. They found her horse a few days later, wandering near the gorge. But no sign of her. The sheriff said she probably fell, that the river carried her away. But I never believed it. Martha was too good a rider. Too careful. He fell silent, and Eleanor sensed he needed to speak more than he needed a response. The whispers started, of course, he continued, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. They said she'd left me. Found someone younger. Someone. Whole. His hand drifted unconsciously to his bad leg. But they didn't know her. They didn't know us. He finally rose and turned to face her, his eyes full of a pain so raw it was difficult to look at. Why are you here, Eli? The real reason. The question, so direct and unexpected, stole the air from her lungs. Had he guessed? Was this some kind of trap? I told you, she managed, her voice barely a whisper. I was looking for work. There are 100 ranches between here and whatever hell you ran from. Why this one? Because it was the end of the world. Because no one would ever think to look for her here. Because she was so tired of running. I heard you were a fair man, she said instead, the words feeling thin and inadequate. That you judge a person on their work, not their past. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe even a hint of recognition. And what's in your past that needs hiding so badly, I wonder? The question hung between them, as dangerous and loaded as a cocked pistol. She could feel the precipice beneath her feet. One wrong word, one slip, and her entire world would shatter. Everyone has things they're running from, she said at last, her voice soft. True enough. His gaze was searching, intense, as if he were trying to peel back the layers of her disguise through sheer force of will. But not everyone has a reason to hide who they truly are. Her blood turned to ice. He knew. He had to know. She took an involuntary step backward, her mind racing. Deny it? Run? Neither seemed like a viable option, but Blackwood made no move to expose her. Instead, he let out a long, weary sigh, the fight seeming to go out of him. Whatever you're running from, boy, just make sure it doesn't bring more trouble here. I've buried enough ghosts for one lifetime. He turned and limped past her, heading back down the trail toward the ranch. He paused once, glancing back over his shoulder. The mare's coming along nicely, he said, his tone deliberately casual now. You have a gift. It'd be a shame to waste it. Then he was gone, disappearing into the twilight shadows of the aspens, leaving Eleanor alone with the nameless grave and the terrifying, unsettling realization that Thaddeus Blackwood saw far more than she had ever wanted him to. He had given her a warning, but he had also offered her a strange, unspoken sanctuary. The question was, which one would save her, and which one would end up getting her killed? The encounter at the grave left Eleanor deeply shaken. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't seem to reach. Not everyone has a reason to hide who they truly are. Blackwood's words echoed in the suffocating darkness of the bunkhouse, tangled with the snores of the other men. How much did he know? And if he suspected the truth, why was he letting her stay? What game was he playing? Frustrated and restless, she slipped from her bunk, pulled on her boots, and crept out into the night. The Wyoming sky was a breathtaking tapestry of stars, a cold, indifferent beauty that made her feel impossibly small. Her feet, seemingly with a will of their own, carried her toward the main house. A single lamp burned in a downstairs window, a lonely beacon in the vast darkness. It was his study. He was awake too. Drawn by a curiosity she couldn't explain, she moved closer, staying in the deep shadows of a large cottonwood tree. Through the uncurtained window she could see him. He was sitting at his massive desk, his head bent over what looked like a journal. He reached for a glass of whiskey, his movements slow and heavy with a weariness that seemed to go clear to his soul. She knew she should leave. Spying on her employer was a dangerous, foolish thing to do. Yet she was rooted to the spot, held captive by a strange, unexpected wave of empathy for this broken, solitary man. As she watched, he turned a page in the journal, and his expression softened. His lips moved silently, as if he were speaking to someone only he could see. With a sudden, painful pang, Eleanor realized what he was doing. He was reading his wife's journal. He was spending the lonely hours of the night keeping company with her ghost. The intimacy of the moment was like a physical blow. She felt like a trespasser, a voyeur peering into a sacred, private grief. She took a step back, intending to slip away into the darkness, but her boot caught a loose stone. It skittered across the hard-packed earth, the small sound magnified 100 times in the dead quiet of the night. Blackwood's head snapped up, his eyes instantly locking on the window. His hand moved instinctively toward a desk drawer where she had no doubt he kept a gun. She was caught. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Running would only confirm his suspicions. For a long, agonizing heartbeat, their eyes locked through the glass. Then with a deliberate slowness, Blackwood closed the journal, stood up, and walked toward the front door. Eleanor braced herself for the confrontation. The door creaked open, spilling lamplight onto the porch and silhouetting his tall frame. A bit late for a stroll, isn't it, Eli? His voice wasn't angry, just tired. So incredibly tired. Couldn't sleep, she replied, fighting to keep her own voice even. Sorry if I disturbed you. He studied her for a long moment, his face hidden in the shadows. Come inside, he said at last. The invitation was the last thing she had expected. Since we're both awake, we might as well make it useful. Hesitation warred with a desperate need to understand this man. Entering his house, his private space, felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. Come on, boy, I don't bite, he said, and she could hear the faint trace of a smile in his voice. And I've got coffee that doesn't taste like it was brewed in an old boot, which is more than I can say for what Victor serves up. The promise of decent coffee was strangely compelling. She followed him inside, her nerves screaming as he closed the heavy door behind them. The study smelled of leather, old paper, and the faint, surprising scent of dried lavender. It was Martha's scent, she realized. Her ghost was everywhere in this room. Sit, he said, gesturing to a worn leather armchair. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot warming on a small burner. Black is fine, she said, perching on the edge of the chair, feeling like a cornered animal. He handed her a cup and settled into the chair opposite her, grimacing as he stretched out his bad leg. So, he said, his gaze sharp and direct over the rim of his cup. Want to tell me why you're really prowling around my house in the middle of the night? The directness of the question was like a splash of cold water. Like I said, couldn't sleep. Nightmares? He asked. The perception was so acute it startled her. She looked down into her coffee, unable to meet his eyes. Sometimes, she admitted. He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. The war does that to a man. I wasn't in the war, she said quickly. Too young. Maybe not that war, he replied, his voice soft. But you're fighting one, Eli. I can see it in your eyes. It's the look of someone who's seen too much. Too young. His words were too close to the bone, too near the raw, bleeding heart of her secret. She took a shaky sip of coffee, the hot liquid a welcome distraction. You know, he said, leaning back in his chair, when you first showed up, I was certain you were a liar. Too polite, too well-spoken for a common drifter, too careful. Eleanor's heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. And now, he continued, his eyes softening almost imperceptibly, now I think you're just someone who's had to learn caution the hard way. Someone who has lost more than they're willing to admit. The simple, unvarnished truth of his statement, the quiet acknowledgement of her pain, brought a hot lump to her throat. She had been so alone for so long, and this man, this stranger, saw her. He didn't know the details, but he saw the shape of her sorrow. He seemed to sense her turmoil and mercifully changed the subject. The mayor responds well to you. Duchess, you call her? Eleanor flushed, caught off guard by her slip. Just easier than calling her the Black Mare. It's a good name, it suits her, he said. You've got a gift with the broken ones. She's not broken, Eleanor found herself saying, her voice passionate. She's just afraid. There's a difference. Broken means something vital is gone forever. She's just forgotten how to trust. His eyebrows rose slightly. He seemed to be considering her words, applying them to more than just the horse. You know, he said, his gaze drifting to the journal on his desk. Martha used to say the same thing. She said that trust had to be earned, never demanded, that patience was the only currency that mattered with wounded creatures. His eyes refocused on Eleanor with a sudden, startling intensity. She was the strongest person I ever knew. People underestimated her, just as I suspect they've underestimated you. The statement hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Before Eleanor could even begin to process it, a loud, urgent knock echoed from the front door. Blackwood frowned, glancing at the mantel clock. Who in the devil? He stood up. Wait here. Eleanor listened as he walked to the door. She could hear the low murmur of voices, Blackwood's, and another that was unfamiliar and agitated. The conversation was short. When Blackwood returned to the study, his face had transformed. The weary sadness was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, dangerous fury. Problem? Eleanor asked, her own sense of dread rising. Nothing that concerns you. His tone was clipped, dismissive. He moved to his desk, unlocked the drawer she had noticed earlier, and pulled out a large caliber revolver. He checked the cylinder, then tucked the weapon into the waistband of his trousers. You should get back to the bunkhouse. Dawn will be here before you know it. It was a clear dismissal, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to leave. Is the ranch in danger? The ranch is fine, he cut her off, his voice brokering no argument. This is personal business. Good night, Eli. She rose to her feet, her mind reeling. What could have happened to transform him so completely? As she reached the door, he spoke again, his voice softer now. Eli, she turned. Whatever it is you're running from, whatever brought you to my door, sooner or later a person has to stop running and face what's chasing them. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something that looked terrifyingly like understanding. Sooner or later the truth comes out. She fled from the house, her heart pounding. He knew, or if he didn't know everything, he knew enough. He knew she was a liar. He knew she was running. And he had just been called away on some violent personal business in the middle of the night. Her sanctuary was crumbling around her. The ghosts she thought she'd left behind were closing in, and a terrible new thought began to form in her mind. What if the man she was beginning to trust was just as dangerous as the one she was running from? The next day, a sleek black carriage, pulled by a perfectly matched pair of gleaming bay horses, rolled into the ranch yard. It was a vision of Eastern wealth and power, completely out of place in the rugged, dusty landscape of Wyoming. The ranch hands stopped their work, staring in open-mouthed wonder as a driver in a crisp uniform jumped down to open the carriage door. A man emerged. He was in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than a year's wages for every man on the ranch. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his face clean-shaven and smooth. But despite the civilized veneer, there was a predatory stillness about him, a coiled energy that radiated from him like a cold wave. The smile on his face was a work of art, charming and brilliant, but it never ever reached his eyes. Eleanor, who had been working with Duchess in the round pen, felt the blood drain from her face. Her vision narrowed to a single point. Her breath caught in her throat, a strangled, silent scream. It was Randall Clayton. She ducked instinctively behind the solid bulk of the mare, her body moving before her mind could even process the sheer impossibility of it. He was here. How? How could he possibly have found her? Had someone talked? Had she been betrayed? Through the slats of the corral fence, she watched as Thaddeus Blackwood emerged from the main house. The contrast between the two men was stark and immediate. Blackwood, tall and raw-boned in his worn work clothes. Clayton, shorter, immaculate, radiating a cold, reptilian power. They exchanged a few words, Blackwood's posture rigid and unwelcoming, Clayton's gestures expansive and falsely cordial. Then Blackwood, with a visible reluctance, gestured toward the house. Clayton's cold smile widened as he followed him inside. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at Eleanor's throat. She could run. She could saddle Duchess and flee right now while he was occupied. But where would she go? He had found her at the edge of the world. He would find her again. He had promised her that, his breath hot and rancid in her ear as his knife traced the line on her throat. I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. You all right, boy? She jumped at the sound of the voice, nearly crying out before she recognized Victor standing on the other side of the fence. The old foreman's shrewd eyes were fixed on her face, his gaze uncomfortably intense. Fine, she choked out, forcing her voice to remain low and steady. Who's the visitor? Victor's face, already a road map of grim lines, darkened further. Randall Clayton, railroad man, calls himself a developer. He's a vulture in a fancy suit. He spat into the dust, a gesture of profound contempt. Been buying up land all through the territory, or taking it when buying doesn't work. Eleanor swallowed against the dryness in her throat. What does he want with this ranch? What does any snake want? More. Victor's gaze sharpened, becoming dangerously perceptive. You know him? Never met him, she lied, busying herself with Duchess's halter, unable to meet the old man's eyes. Just curious. Victor didn't look convinced, not for a second. Well, he said, his voice low, whatever history you've got with a man like that, I'd suggest you make yourself scarce. Clayton ain't the forgetting or forgiven kind. He turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor with the terrifying certainty that her disguise was far more transparent than she had ever imagined. For the next hour, she worked with Duchess on autopilot, her mind a whirlwind of terror and frantic calculations. Her entire being was focused on the main house, where the monster from her past was meeting with the enigmatic man who represented her present. What were they talking about? Was her name being spoken? Was Thaddeus Blackwood, at this very moment, learning the full, ugly truth about his mysterious new ranch hand? The sound of the front door opening snapped her to attention. Clayton emerged, his face a thundercloud of barely suppressed rage. Blackwood followed him out onto the porch, his own face a mask of stone. One of his hands rested casually on his hip, dangerously close to the revolver he always wore. They exchanged a few more tense, clipped words. Clayton forced another one of his cold, empty smiles and extended his hand. After a long, pointed hesitation, Blackwood took it, the handshake looking more like a prelude to a fight than a gesture of peace. As Clayton turned to leave, he let his gaze sweep across the ranch yard, a slow, possessive survey, as if he were committing every detail to memory. Eleanor ducked lower behind Duchess, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard across the yard. For one terrible, heart-stopping second, she thought his eyes met hers through the fence slats. She saw a flicker of something, confusion, then a dawning malicious recognition, cross his features. Then he was gone, climbing back into his opulent carriage, which rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Eleanor remained frozen in the round pen, her legs trembling too violently to support her. When she finally found the strength to emerge, Thaddeus Blackwood was waiting for her. His face was grim, his eyes hard as flint. "My office," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Now. Every step toward the main house felt like a march to the gallows. He knew. Clayton had told him. The charade was over. Inside the study, Blackwood closed the door with a quiet, deliberate finality before turning to face her. The room felt small, the walls closing in. "You want to tell me," he began, his voice dangerously soft, "why Randall Clayton took such a particular interest in my new horse wrangler?" Her mouth was too dry to form words. I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" He moved to his desk but didn't sit, leaning against it, looming over her. "He made a point of asking about you, Eli. Said he'd heard I had a new hand who was a miracle with horses. Seemed mighty curious about where I found you." A cold sweat trickled down her spine. "What? What did you tell him?" "That you were a drifter, that your past was none of his damn business." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, pinning her in place. "But it's my business, and I'm asking you now, Eli, if that's even your name. What is your connection to Randall Clayton?" The moment hung on a knife's edge. The truth. He was demanding the truth. But speaking it aloud, saying Clara's name, admitting the depth of her fear and her failure to save her sister. It was a thing she wasn't sure she could survive. "I worked for him once," she said, the partial truth tasting like poison. "It didn't end well. That's not an answer, and we both know it. It's all I can give you," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him to understand, to let it be. "Please." Something in her voice, a note of raw, naked desperation, seemed to reach him. The hard lines of his face softened, just slightly. He let out a long, frustrated sigh. "Clayton is a dangerous man to have as an enemy, boy. Whatever business you have with him, you might be better off clearing out for a while. Head up to the line cabin. Lay low until—" "No!" The word burst from her with a force that surprised them both. "I won't run. Not again. She took a deep, steadying breath, the first one that hadn't felt tight and constricted since the carriage had appeared. If you want to fire me, that's your right. But I will not be driven off this ranch by him. Surprise flickered across Blackwood's face, followed by a glint of something that looked like respect. I'm not firing you, he said, his voice softer. I'm just concerned. Clayton doesn't strike me as a forgiving man. He isn't, she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He studied her for another long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. All right, you stay, but you keep your head down, understood? No more midnight wanderings, no trips to town. You stick close to the ranch, and you make yourself invisible when strangers come calling. The relief was so profound it left her feeling lightheaded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said, his expression turning grim again. Clayton wasn't just here to ask about you. He wants this ranch. Or more specifically, he wants the water rights that come with it. He made me what he called a generous offer. When I refused, he made it very clear that I would regret it. He won't stop, Eleanor said, the words bitter with the taste of experience. Men like him, they don't know how to lose. They just push and they push and they push until they get what they want or they destroy whatever's in their way. Then he's in for a disappointment, Blackwood said, his voice hardening into steel. I buried my father on this land, my mother, and this is where Martha's spirit remains. I'll see him in hell before I let him take it from me. The fierce, defiant declaration stirred something deep inside Eleanor, a grudging admiration for the stubborn, wounded man, and a deep, chilling fear for him. She had seen firsthand what Randall Clayton was capable of. Be careful, she found herself saying. He doesn't play by the rules. Blackwood's eyebrows rose. Sounds like the voice of experience speaking. She looked away, unwilling to meet his searching gaze. Just an observation. He clearly didn't believe her, but he let it go. Your concern is noted. Now get back to that mare. She won't gentle herself. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. Eli? She looked back. His eyes held a depth of understanding that made her breath catch. Whatever he did to you, whatever he took from you, some debts can only be paid in blood. The words followed her out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. He was offering her protection, but he was also acknowledging a dark truth they now shared. They were both enemies of Randall Clayton, and in the Wyoming territory that was a dangerous and likely fatal thing to be. 3 days later, a dust-caked rider on a lathered horse brought a letter. Eleanor was in the barn, grooming Duchess, when she saw Blackwood meet the messenger on the porch of the main house. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the way Blackwood's shoulders went rigid as he read the envelope, the way his knuckles turned white. It was bad news, the worst kind. Blackwood disappeared inside, the letter crumpled in his fist. Eleanor hesitated, Blackwood's order to keep her head down warring with a primal, protective instinct. She couldn't just stand by. She walked to the main house, her boots sounding unnaturally loud on the porch steps. The front door was slightly ajar, and from within, she could hear raised voices. Impossible! It was Blackwood, his voice tight with fury. You know it is. The deed is ironclad. It's been in my family for 3 generations. Iron can be melted, Thaddeus, another voice replied, calm and weary. It was Doc Sullivan, especially when the fire is stoked by a man with Clayton's money and influence. Damn it, Robert. This isn't about money, it's about... I know what it's about, Sullivan cut in, his tone gentle but firm. The question is, how far are you willing to go to protect it? A heavy, suffocating silence fell. Eleanor shifted her weight, and a floorboard groaned beneath her boot. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet house. Who's there? Blackwood called out, his voice sharp as a razor. Caught. She had no choice. She pushed the door open. It's Eli, sir. I saw the messenger. I thought there might be trouble. Blackwood stood in the middle of his study, the crumpled letter in his hand, his face a thundercloud. Doc Sullivan sat in one of the leather armchairs, his expression grave. No trouble, Blackwood said, his tone making a liar of his words. Just business. It was a clear dismissal, but Eleanor found herself unable to move. She was tired of hiding, tired of being a passive victim of Randall Clayton's machinations. If it's Clayton, she heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Maybe I can help. Both men stared at her. It was Sullivan who spoke first. And how exactly could you do that, young man? Eleanor swallowed hard, knowing she was stepping onto a minefield. I told Mr. Blackwood I worked for Clayton once. I know how he thinks. I know how he operates. Do you now? Sullivan exchanged a quick, unreadable look with Blackwood. And what did you do for Mr. Clayton? It was a trap, and she knew it. She chose her words with surgical precision. Horses. I worked with his racing stock back in Kentucky. It wasn't a complete lie. Her father had trained Clayton's horses before Clayton had systematically and ruthlessly destroyed him. And during that time, Sullivan pressed, his eyes seeming to peer right through her disguise. Did you learn anything about his business methods? His weaknesses? She glanced at Blackwood. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Permission. He's meticulous, she began slowly, the memories rising like bile in her throat. He keeps detailed records of everything. Every deal, every threat, every bribe. He uses legitimate businesses as fronts for his dirtier work, and he prefers to let others carry out his orders, so his own hands stay clean. His weaknesses? Sullivan asked, leaning forward. His interest clearly piqued. Eleanor thought of the man who had charmed her mother, manipulated her father, and looked at her 16-year-old sister with a naked, possessive hunger. Pride, she said, the word tasting like ash. He cannot stand to be challenged or made to look foolish, and he underestimates people he considers beneath him, especially women. He sees them as possessions, trophies to be won or discarded. It's his greatest blind spot. The two men exchanged another of those loaded glances. Blackwood uncrumpled the letter in his hand. Clayton has filed a legal claim against my water right, he said, his voice flat and hard. He's produced some forged document claiming the North Fork of the creek belongs to a parcel of land he recently acquired. Without that water, half my grazing land becomes worthless within a year. He's trying to bleed you dry, Eleanor said, the strategy sickeningly familiar. Force you into a legal battle you can't afford to fight, so you'll have no choice but to sell to him on his terms. Precisely, Sullivan said, rising to pour 3 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Blackwood, and to Eleanor's surprise, he offered one to her. It was an invitation, an acceptance. She was no longer just the hired help. She was in the war room. What we need, Sullivan said, is leverage. Something Clayton fears more than he wants this ranch. You think something like that exists? Blackwood asked, his voice laced with bitter skepticism. I know it does, Sullivan replied grimly. The question is how to find it. Eleanor's mind was racing, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. You said he keeps records, she said, looking at Blackwood. Detailed records of everything. Blackwood nodded slowly, his eyes lighting with a dawning, dangerous understanding. His private ledgers, not the official books he shows to his investors, the real ones. You're talking about breaking into his office, Eleanor stated, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. I'm talking about justice, Blackwood corrected, his voice a low, dangerous growl. For Martha, and for every other person this man has destroyed. The words resonated deep in her soul, echoing her own unspoken, burning need. Justice for Clara, justice for her father. It's too dangerous, she said, not as a protest, but as a simple statement of fact. Which is why I'll do it myself, Blackwood declared. No. The word flew from her lips, sharp and absolute. Both men stared at her. I mean, you can't, she amended hastily. You're Thaddeus Blackwood. Everyone in this territory knows you. If you're seen anywhere near Clayton's office, he'll know immediately. But me? She took a deep breath. No one knows me. I'm just a drifter, a nameless, faceless boy. I can get in. I know what to look for. Absolutely not, Blackwood said, his voice firm. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment Clayton rode onto this ranch, she retorted, her own voice rising with a passion that surprised her. He threatened this place. He threatened you. I owe you that much. The boy has a point, Thaddeus, Sullivan interjected quietly. he's far less likely to be recognized. Blackwood paced the room, his limp more pronounced with his agitation. It's too risky. If Clayton catches him, he won't, Eleanor said, with a confidence she didn't feel. I'll be careful. For a long, tense moment, Blackwood waged a silent, internal battle. Finally, he stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes full of a reluctant, grudging acceptance. We'll work out the details later, when we have more information. For now, not a word of this to anyone. Understood? Eleanor nodded, relief and a terrifying, exhilarating fear warring within her. She had just volunteered to walk directly back into the path of the monster she had spent months running from. As she turned to leave, Sullivan's voice stopped her. One moment, Eli. The old doctor's eyes were sharp, his gaze fixed on the bandana around her neck. That scar you worked so hard to hide. Randall Clayton's handiwork, I presume. The blood drained from her face. How could he possibly know? It looks like a knife wound, Sullivan continued, his voice soft but relentless. The kind a man makes when he wants to leave a permanent reminder, a brand of ownership. Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, Blackwood stepped between them. That's enough, Robert. The boy's past is his own. Sullivan held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. Of course. Just remember, young Eli, he said, his words a cryptic warning. Secrets have a way of coming out, usually at the worst possible time. He left, leaving Eleanor alone with Blackwood and the chilling sense that her world was balanced on a razor's edge. Go, Blackwood said, his voice softer now. The other hands will be wondering where you are. As she reached the door, he spoke one last time. Whatever he did to you, whatever drove you to hide who you are, just know that there are some secrets worth keeping, and others that will eat a person's soul until there's nothing left but the lie. The words were both a warning and a strange, unexpected offer of absolution. She walked out into the sunlight, her mind reeling. She was no longer just running from Randall Clayton. She was going to hunt him, and she had a feeling that this path would either lead to justice or to a grave right next to Martha Blackwood's. A relentless 3-day storm descended on the ranch, turning the world into a gray, muddy blur. The forced inactivity was a kind of torture, each passing hour a reminder that Clayton's deadline was approaching. The plan to break into his office and find the ledgers felt both insane and absolutely necessary. Doc Sullivan had ridden out for Cheyenne 2 days ago, using the excuse of replenishing medical supplies to actually visit a contact at the Territorial Land Office. He was due back today, if he could make it through the deluge. Eleanor stood in the wide doorway of the barn, watching the rain fall in solid silver sheets. Behind her, Duchess nickered softly in her stall. The mare was her only solace, the one creature to whom she didn't have to lie. Restless girl, she murmured, stroking the mare's sleek black neck. Makes 2 of us. Make it 3. She started at the sound of Blackwood's voice. He was standing just a few feet away, water dripping from the brim of his hat. Mr. Blackwood, didn't hear you approach. The weather's good for moving quiet. He looked at Duchess, his gaze appreciative. How's she doing? She's ready for a rider, Eleanor said. When the weather clears. His eyebrows rose. That was fast work. She was never truly wild, Eleanor explained, her voice soft. Just forgotten how to trust. She remembers being handled. I just had to remind her that not all hands bring pain. A flicker of something, understanding perhaps, passed through Blackwood's eyes. You've done good work with her, Eli. You should be the first to ride her. The quiet praise warmed her more than it should have. Any word from Doc Sullivan? She asked, following him as he moved down the row of stalls, checking on the other horses. Not yet. He paused, turning to face her. There's been a change of plans. Eleanor tensed. What kind of change? My sources in town tell me Clayton is leaving for Denver in 3 days. He's taking his most trusted men with him. And, more importantly, he's taking his private ledgers. The implications hit her like a physical blow. So we don't have weeks. We have 3 days. Less than that, Blackwood said, his expression grim. The night before he leaves, he's hosting a large party at his estate. Investors, politicians. The whole damn territory's elite. It's our only chance. The house will be full of people. Security will be focused on the guests. It's the perfect cover. He held her gaze, his own eyes dark and serious. Still want to be a part of this? It's more dangerous than we planned. He was offering her an out, a chance to walk away, to disappear again before the final, bloody act began. But the thought of running, of letting Clayton win, of leaving Blackwood to fight this battle alone, was unthinkable. Clara's face flashed in her mind, her silent scream echoing in her memory. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm. Respect flickered in his eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. "Good. We'll finalize the details when Sullivan gets back. For now." We wait. A sudden gust of wind rattled the barn doors and thunder rumbled in the distance. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls. "Might be a long wait," Blackwood said, settling onto a hay bale and stretching out his bad leg with a wince. "Might as well make ourselves comfortable." He paused. "You play chess?" The question was so unexpected it startled her. "I do. My father taught me." "Wait here." He disappeared into the tack room and returned with a small, well-worn wooden chess set. "Martha gave me this," he said, his voice softening as he set up the pieces on an old crate between them. "Said a man who spent all his time with horses needed something to keep his mind sharp. She was a formidable player. I could never beat her." He gestured to the white pieces. "Your move." They played in silence, the only sounds the drumming of the rain on the roof and the soft stamp of hooves on straw. He was an aggressive player, all bold attacks and daring sacrifices. She was more patient, defensive, setting subtle traps he didn't see until it was too late. "You play like her," he said suddenly, after she captured his queen with a cunningly placed bishop. "Patient, thoughtful. You see the whole board." The comparison made her uncomfortable. "My father used to say that a game of chess reveals a person's true character." "Wise man, your father," Blackwood said, his gaze penetrating. "What else did he teach you?" "The value of hard work," she said carefully, "the importance of integrity." "And did he teach you how to lie?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp as a shard of glass. "How to hide in plain sight?" Her hand froze over her knight. She looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs. His expression wasn't angry or accusatory. It was just curious. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, the denial tasting like ash on her tongue. He let out a long, slow sigh and leaned back, knocking over his own king in a gesture of concession. "I think you do, Eli. Or should I say, Eleanor?" The sound of her own name, her true name, spoken aloud in his rough voice, shattered the fragile reality she had built. The chess piece slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the board. The game was over. "How long have you known?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I suspected from the first day," he admitted. "The hands, the voice. But I knew for certain when I saw you with the mare. No man speaks to a horse with a woman's intuition. No man binds his chest so tightly it's a wonder he can breathe." Heat flooded her face, humiliation, fear. Are you going to fire me?" To her utter astonishment, he chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "Eleanor, if I was going to fire you, I'd have done it weeks ago. Your gender is of no concern to me. Your character and your skill are what matter." He began to set the chess pieces back in their box, his movements methodical. "I'm telling you now because we're about to walk into the lion's den together. Secrets between allies can get people killed. And I need to know the truth. All of it. What is your war with Randall Clayton?" She opened her mouth to speak, to finally unload the terrible burden she had been carrying for so long. But the words wouldn't come. The habit of silence, of self-preservation, was too deeply ingrained. "I can't," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "I just can't." He studied her face for a long moment, and whatever he saw there made his expression soften. "All right," he said, his voice gentle. "Keep your secrets for now. But know this. Whatever he did to you, whatever drove you to this, you are not alone in it anymore. When you are ready to tell your story, I will be ready to listen." The simple, unconditional acceptance was more devastating than any accusation. It broke through the walls she had built around her heart, and hot tears pricked at the backs of her eyes. She blinked them away fiercely, focusing on the wooden box in his hands. Before she could speak, the barn doors burst open with a crash, revealing a drenched, mud-spattered Doc Sullivan. "Thaddeus!" he called out, his voice urgent. "I found something. Something that changes everything." He strode toward them, pulling a folded, oilskin-wrapped document from inside his coat. He spread it out on the crate, weighing down the corners with chess pieces. It was an old, faded survey map. "The original survey of this ranch," Sullivan announced, his voice triumphant, "filed by your grandfather in 1832. It was misfiled in the mining claims archive. And look here." He pointed a trembling finger at the map. "The North Fork of the creek, explicitly marked with water rights fully delineated as part of the Blackwood property. Clayton's claim is built on a lie." It was the first piece of good news they'd had. But Sullivan wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, his expression turning grim. "And it's not good. Clayton's party, the night before he leaves for Denver. My contact gave me a partial guest list. An invitation was extended to a Mr. Victor Maxwell. The name hung in the air, cold and heavy. Victor, the foreman, the man who had been watching her with suspicious eyes from the very beginning. "Victor is working for Clayton?" Blackwood's voice was dangerously quiet. "I don't know," Sullivan admitted, "but it means we have a spy in our midst, an enemy inside the gates." The revelation was like a pail of ice water. The man who had warned Eleanor about Blackwood's trouble might be the very source of it. They were walking into a trap, and the man leading them to the gallows could be the one they trusted to guard their backs. The game had just become infinitely more deadly. The air in the barn grew thick with paranoia. Victor, a spy. It made a terrible kind of sense. His pointed questions, his cryptic warnings, his constant, watchful presence. Had it all been an act? Was he feeding information to Clayton? "We need to know for sure," Blackwood said, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. "Tonight. I'll invite him to the house for a drink. Keep him occupied. You two," he looked at Eleanor and Sullivan, "will search his cabin. If he's working for Clayton, he'll have something. A letter, extra money, something that proves it." The plan was simple, brutal, and necessary. As darkness fell, Eleanor watched from the shadows as Blackwood intercepted the foreman. The offer of a rare bottle of Kentucky bourbon a convincing lure. Once they were inside the main house, she and Sullivan moved through the driving rain toward Victor's small, isolated cabin. The lock was primitive, and Sullivan, with a set of slender tools that looked suspiciously like surgical instruments, had it open in seconds. "A skill one acquires in the field," he murmured, catching Eleanor's surprised look. The cabin was sparse, obsessively neat. A soldier's quarters. A narrow bed, a table, a small trunk at the foot of the bed. "You take the trunk," Sullivan whispered. "I'll check the floorboards." Eleanor knelt and lifted the heavy lid. Inside were neatly folded clothes, a pair of worn boots, a few books. Nothing. She began to feel through the layers of clothing, her fingers searching for anything out of the ordinary. Near the bottom, tucked inside a folded wool shirt, she felt something hard. A small wooden box. It was intricately carved with a floral pattern, delicate and clearly feminine. A lady's keepsake box. It was completely out of place among Victor's Spartan belongings. "Robert," she called softly, "look at this." Sullivan abandoned his probing of the floorboards and knelt beside her. The box was locked. Without a word, Eleanor drew her knife and slipped the thin, sharp tip into the seam. With a soft click, the lock gave way. The contents stole the breath from her lungs. Nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet lay a delicate gold locket, a folded piece of fine silk, and a small stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Sullivan picked up the locket and opened it. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young, beautiful woman with serious, intelligent eyes. "Who is she?" he breathed. Eleanor's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon and unfolded the topmost letter. The handwriting was an elegant, feminine script. "My dearest Victor," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Your last letter brought both joy and sorrow. I understand your reasons for keeping our engagement private, though it pains me. Mr. Clayton continues his unwelcome attentions, despite my clear refusals. Father says I should be flattered, but there is something in his eyes that frightens me." She skipped to the bottom of the page. Yours always, your devoted Martha. The name landed like a bomb in the small silent cabin. Martha, Thaddeus Blackwood's wife, the woman whose ghost haunted the entire ranch. She and Victor had been engaged. Dear God, Sullivan whispered, his face ashen. They looked at each other, the horrifying implications crashing down on them. Victor hadn't just been a loyal foreman. He was the man Martha had left behind. He had worked for years for the man who had married the woman he loved. The motive for betrayal, for a deep, festering resentment, was suddenly blindingly clear. We have to show this to Thaddeus, Eleanor said, gathering the letters. Careful, this will destroy him, Sullivan warned. They were about to leave when the cabin door creaked open behind them. They whirled around, their hearts leaping into their throats. Victor Maxwell stood in the doorway, his weathered face a mask of cold, quiet fury. His eyes were fixed on the letters in Eleanor's hand. I should have known, he said, his voice flat and dead. The fancy bourbon, the invitation to the main house. It was all a little too convenient. He took a step into the room. Put those down, boy. They don't belong to you. They belong to Thaddeus Blackwood, Eleanor shot back, her fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline, along with an explanation for why his most trusted foreman is a spy for Randall Clayton. A strange, bitter smile touched Victor's lips. Is that what you think? That I'm Clayton's man? He shook his head slowly. You don't know a damn thing. Then enlighten us, Sullivan said, his voice dangerously calm. Why are you on the guest list for Clayton's party? And why did you keep your relationship with Martha a secret for all these years? Victor stared at them, and for a moment Eleanor thought he would refuse. Then the fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a weariness that was painful to watch. He sank onto the edge of his bed. Martha and we were promised to each other before the war, he began, his voice a low rasp. When I came back, everything had changed. She had chosen Thaddeus. He was a good man. He could give her the life I couldn't. So I stayed. It was the only way I could watch over her. Protect her. His voice broke. I failed. What happened to her, Victor? Eleanor pressed. Did Clayton have something to do with it? At the mention of Clayton's name, a dark, venomous hatred flared in Victor's eyes. Yes, he said simply, but not in the way you think. He reached down and pried up a loose floorboard Sullivan had missed. From the hollow space beneath, he withdrew a small leather pouch. Inside was a single, folded piece of paper. 3 days before she disappeared, Martha gave me this. She made me promise to give it to Thaddeus if anything happened to her. Sullivan took the paper and unfolded it. His eyes widened in shock. This is a list of Clayton's secret investors in the railroad, with notes detailing bribery, illegal land seizures. She was clever, Victor said, a ghost of pride in his voice. She'd gotten suspicious of Clayton, started asking questions. He must have found out. The day she vanished, she was on her way to meet someone who was going to give her definitive proof of his crimes. And you think Clayton had her killed to silence her? Eleanor finished, the pattern chillingly familiar. I know he did, Victor said grimly, but I could never prove it. So for 5 years I've been waiting, watching, gathering my own information. That party invitation? It's my one chance to get inside his house, to get into his study where he keeps his real ledgers. He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes sharp and knowing. Just like he doesn't suspect me, he doesn't suspect that the new ranch hand everyone's talking about might be more than just a boy. Eleanor froze. I know who you are, Miss Hayes, Victor said quietly. I've known almost from the beginning. Clayton's men have been asking questions for months about a young woman who fled St. Louis, a woman with a distinctive scar on her throat. The revelation was stunning. All this time, he hadn't been her enemy. He had been her silent, watchful guardian. Then why didn't you tell Blackwood? Sullivan asked, gesturing to the damning document in his hand. Because knowing she died for this, and being unable to prove it, would have destroyed him, Victor said. It would have driven him to a reckless confrontation with Clayton that would have gotten him killed. That wasn't your decision to make. The new voice came from the doorway, All three of them turned to see Thaddeus Blackwood standing there, his face a mask of stone, his eyes burning with a terrible, betrayed light. He had clearly heard everything. "Thaddeus," Sullivan began, but Blackwood ignored him, his gaze locked on Victor. "You should have told me," Blackwood said, his voice deceptively soft. "And what would you have done?" Victor shot back, rising to his feet. "Ridden into town and put a bullet in him? Gotten yourself hanged? That wouldn't have been justice. It would have been a waste." "She was my wife," Blackwood roared, his control finally snapping. "And she was the woman I loved first," Victor roared back, his own pain and grief from years of silence finally exploding to the surface. "She loved you, Thaddeus. Never doubt that. But she was a fighter, and she was fighting Clayton when she died. I honored her by continuing that fight, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to strike." The two men stood facing each other, two sides of the same coin, their shared love for one woman and their shared hatred for another finally laid bare. The air in the small cabin crackled with a raw, powerful emotion. Then Blackwood's shoulders slumped. The anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "Show me," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Show me what she found. Show me what got her killed." Victor nodded to Sullivan, who silently handed the document to Blackwood. He read it, his face growing paler with each line. Finally, he folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket. He looked up, no longer at Victor, but at all of them, his eyes clear and hard, with a new, terrible resolve. "This changes the plan," he said, his voice cold as the steel of a gun barrel. "We are no longer just looking for leverage. We are looking for proof. Proof of murder." He turned to Eleanor, and for the first time he saw not the boy Eli, but the woman she truly was, a fellow survivor in a war against a common enemy. "It seems you and I have more in common than I knew, Miss Hayes. Clayton took the most important person in the world from both of us." His voice dropped to a near whisper, a vow spoken in the eye of the storm. "Now, we are going to take everything from him." The plan they hatched in that tiny cabin was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They would all go to Clayton's party. Blackwood and Sullivan had secured their own invitations through their standing in the community. Victor would use his, playing the part of a potential ally. And Eleanor would play the most dangerous role of all. She stood before the mirror in what had once been Martha Blackwood's bedroom, a ghost in a borrowed gown. The dress, a deep emerald silk found packed away in a trunk, felt alien against her skin after months of rough cotton and wool. Sullivan, with a surprising flair, had arranged her short hair into an elegant style. With a touch of powder and rouge from one of Martha's old vanities, the transformation was complete. The rough-edged boy, Eli, was gone. In his place stood an elegant, sophisticated woman, a stranger. A soft knock came at the door. It was Blackwood. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. He was dressed in a formal suit, the unfamiliar clothing making him seem taller, more imposing, but also more vulnerable. "Eleanor," he said, her name sounding strange and wonderful on his lips. "You look—" "Strange," she supplied, a nervous tremor in her voice. "I was going to say remarkable," he corrected softly. He stepped into the room holding a small velvet box. "I want you to wear this." He opened it to reveal a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. It was Martha's. "Thaddeus, I couldn't." "It's not just for sentiment," he said, his voice gentle. "It opens. There's a small mirror inside. Useful if you need to see what's happening behind you." She turned, allowing him to fasten the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, a brief, warm touch that sent an unexpected shiver through her. She turned back to face him, the weight of the locket a tangible connection to the woman whose fight she was about to finish. "Be careful tonight," he said, his voice low and intense. "If he recognizes you—" "He won't," she said, with more confidence than she felt. It was then, standing so close to him, seeing the raw concern in his eyes, that the dam inside her finally broke. "Clara," she whispered, the name a painful, ragged breath. Her name was Clara. My sister. She was 16. The story poured out of her, a torrent of grief and rage she had held back for so long. She told him everything. About Clara witnessing Clayton assaulting a maid. About his cold-blooded murder to silence her. About the knife at her own throat, the searing pain, the desperate flight into the night. When she was finished, she tilted her chin up, showing him the full length of the silvery scar. He listened without interrupting, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. When she was done, he reached out, his fingers hovering just above the scar, not quite daring to touch it. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Sorry you had to carry this alone." "I'm not alone," she whispered. "Not anymore." Clayton's mansion was an obscene monument to greed, a grotesque Victorian palace dropped onto the rugged Wyoming plains. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet corruption. Territorial officials, wealthy investors, and local sycophants mingled, drinking champagne and feasting on Clayton's largesse. "Remember," Sullivan murmured as they entered, "you are Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, my widowed niece from Boston, here to explore investment opportunities. You are charming, intelligent, and utterly bored by local gossip." The charade began. Sullivan introduced her to the great man himself. Randall Clayton took her hand, his touch like a cold reptile against her skin, his eyes sweeping over her with a connoisseur's appreciation. "Mrs. Sullivan," he purred, his smile a predatory slash. "A pleasure to welcome such beauty to our humble frontier. You seem familiar. Have we met?" Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was smooth as silk. "I'm certain I would have remembered meeting such a distinguished man, Mr. Clayton." His ego preened, the flicker of recognition in his eyes fading. He was hooked. He spoke of his railroad, of profits and power, and Eleanor played her part, feigning interest, asking intelligent questions, subtly stroking his vanity. She mentioned her late husband's interest in railways, establishing a plausible reason for her knowledge. The bait was a suggestion that she represented a significant Boston-based investment. "Perhaps," he said, his eyes gleaming with avarice, "you would be interested in seeing some of our more exclusive prospectuses. They are in my study." It was working. He was leading her directly to the prize. He led her away from the party, down a quiet hallway, to the massive mahogany door of his private office. As they walked, she caught Blackwood's eye across the crowded room. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. All the pieces were in place. The study was a shrine to power. Dark wood, leather-bound books, the dead eyes of mounted animals staring from the walls. He poured them both a brandy. As he turned his back to open the massive wall safe behind a painting, Eleanor acted. With a swift, practiced movement, she unstoppered the small vial Sullivan had given her and emptied its contents, a powerful, fast-acting sedative, into Clayton's glass. He turned back, handing her a thick portfolio. "To new partnership," he said, raising his glass. "To new partnerships," she echoed, her heart pounding, "and to old reckonings." He frowned slightly at her strange choice of words, but before he could question her, a knock came at the door. It was a servant. "Sir, the governor insists on a word. He says it is urgent." The diversion, perfectly timed by Blackwood. Clayton scowled, annoyed at the interruption. "Excuse me for a moment, Mrs. Sullivan. Please make yourself comfortable. Review these materials. I shall return shortly." The moment the door closed behind him, Eleanor flew into action. The safe was still partially open. She didn't have the combination, but she didn't need it. She reached inside, her fingers searching for the ledgers Victor had described. There, a slim, red leather-bound book marked WCR Special Accounts. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. She opened it on the desk. It was all there, a meticulous record of bribes, threats, and violence. And then she saw it, a separate section titled Impediments Removed. It was a clinical, chilling list of names and dates. Her eyes scanned the page, and her blood ran cold. MB, excessive curiosity, permanent solution applied, Martha Blackwood. And beneath it, another entry from 2 years prior. CH, witness elimination, confirmed. EH, attempted silencing, unsuccessful, subject fled. Whereabouts unknown. Clara Hayes, Eleanor Hayes. Her sister's murder, her own attempted murder, reduced to a cold, bureaucratic entry in a ledger of death. A wave of nausea and pure, unadulterated hatred washed over her. She pulled out the small, experimental camera Sullivan had procured, a new invention barely larger than her palm, and began to photograph the page. She was so focused on her task, so lost in the horror of the ledger, that she didn't hear the footsteps in the hall until it was too late. The doorknob began to turn. She scrambled, shoving the ledger back into the safe, grabbing the camera, and diving back into her chair, just as the door swung open. But it wasn't Clayton. It was Victor. His face was pale, his eyes urgent. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice loud and formal for anyone who might be listening, "your uncle has been called away. He asked that you join him at once." It was a warning. The plan had gone wrong. As they hurried back down the hall, he leaned close, his voice a frantic whisper. "It's Clayton. The sedative didn't work. He barely touched his drink. He's suspicious. He's questioning the servants about Blackwood." They were almost at the exit, almost free, when Clayton's voice, cold and sharp as ice, cut through the noise of the party. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Sullivan?" They turned. He was standing 10 feet away, his charming mask completely gone. In its place was a look of pure, murderous rage. His eyes weren't on her face. They were locked on the faint, silvery line of the scar on her throat, which was partially visible above the collar of her dress. "Eleanor Hayes," he hissed, the name a death sentence. "I should have known. Did you really think a different dress and a little powder could fool me?" He took a step closer, his hand drifting toward the inside of his jacket. "Did you really think you could escape me?" The partygoers around them began to fall silent, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. "It's over, Clayton," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "We have it all. The ledger. The proof." "Nothing is over," a new voice boomed. Thaddeus Blackwood stepped out from the crowd, placing himself between Eleanor and Clayton. "Not until you paid for what you did to my wife." Clayton's eyes darted between them, a cornered rat realizing the trap had finally sprung. His hand shot inside his coat and emerged with a small, deadly silver derringer. The movement was a blur. A woman screamed. But before he could aim, before he could fire, Blackwood lunged. He grabbed Clayton's wrist, forcing the gun upward as it discharged with a deafening crack. The bullet shattered the massive crystal chandelier overhead, raining down a shower of glittering, deadly shards. The ballroom erupted into chaos. In the flickering, chaotic light, the two men wrestled for the gun, a desperate, silent struggle of pure hatred. Clayton, smaller but wiry and vicious, slammed his elbow into Blackwood's face. Blackwood grunted, his grip slipping. The gun wavered, pointing wildly. Another shot rang out, then a third. The sound was followed by a sickening, wet thud. The struggle stopped. For a heart-stopping second, the two men stood locked together. Then Clayton's eyes went wide with a look of stunned surprise. He looked down at his chest where a dark crimson flower was blooming on his pristine white shirt. He collapsed to the floor, the silver derringer clattering from his limp hand. Thaddeus Blackwood stood over him, his chest heaving, his face a mask of grim, terrible satisfaction. "For Martha," he said, his voice a ragged whisper, "and for Clara." Silence descended on the ballroom, a stunned, horrified silence broken only by the tinkling of the last few pieces of falling crystal. The monster was dead. The long, bloody waltz was finally over. In the aftermath, the world seemed to move in slow motion. The arrival of the town marshal, the shocked faces of the guests, the quiet, efficient work of Doc Sullivan confirming what everyone already knew. It was all a blur to Eleanor. Her entire focus was on Thaddeus, who stood tall and unbowed, admitting to what he had done. The coroner's inquest was a mere formality. The evidence from Clayton's ledger, laid bare for the entire territory to see, was too damning. It painted a picture of a man so corrupt, so evil, that his death was seen less as a crime and more as a long overdue execution. Eleanor's testimony, where she finally told her full story under her own name, was the final nail in Clayton's coffin. The verdict was justifiable homicide. Thaddeus Blackwood walked free. During the search of Clayton's estate, the marshal's deputies found what was left of Martha Blackwood, buried in a shallow, unmarked grave beneath the floor of the stables. They returned her wedding band to Thaddeus, the inscription inside still clear. TB to MB forever. They buried her on a crisp autumn day in the aspen grove where the unmarked cross had stood for 5 long years. The entire ranch was there, along with Doc Sullivan and a quiet, somber Victor, who placed a single white rose on her coffin before it was lowered into the earth. After the funeral, as the sun began to set, Thaddeus and Eleanor stood before the new grave. "He took my past," Thaddeus said, his voice thick with a grief that was finally allowed to be real. "But he will not have my future." He turned to her, his eyes clear and full of a quiet, powerful emotion. "I'm offering you a partnership, Eleanor, in this ranch, in its future." He took a deep breath. "In my life, if you'll have it." It wasn't a passionate, flowery proposal. It was something better. It was real. It was a promise of a new beginning, a future built not on lies and fear, but on shared strength and hard-won peace. "Yes," she whispered, the word a release, a prayer, an acceptance of a life she never thought she would have. "Yes." 1 year later, a magnificent black mare thundered across the open meadows of the Blackwood Ranch, her rider moving with her in perfect, fluid harmony. Eleanor leaned low over Duchess's neck, the Wyoming wind whipping through her hair, which had grown long again. The feel of the powerful horse beneath her, the vast open sky above, the solid, comforting presence of the ranch house on the horizon. This was not just survival. This was life. She reined in the mare at the creek, sliding from the saddle just as another rider appeared on the ridge. It was Thaddeus. The lines of grief on his face had softened over the past year, replaced by a quiet contentment. He dismounted and walked to her, taking her hand in his. "Sullivan's back from town," he said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "He brought the mail, and this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple gold band. Their wedding was a month away, a new beginning, a future they would build together on a foundation of honesty and trust. They were both scarred, both survivors of a terrible war, but they had found a peaceful shore in each other. As they rode back to the ranch, side by side, Eleanor glanced at the scar on her throat, a faint, silvery line she no longer bothered to hide. It was a reminder not of a monster's cruelty, but of her own strength. She had faced the darkness and walked out into the light. She had come to this place as Eli, a boy running from ghosts. She would stay as Eleanor Blackwood, a woman who had finally come home. If you were captivated by this story of survival and justice on the untamed frontier, and you want to hear more tales of darkness, mystery, and the strange and fascinating corners of history, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss another story. Thank you for listening.